right, welcome back to our podcast, and I'm here once again, continuing our series here with our guest Douglas Martin. Today, the topic is going to be religion. It's going to be quite an interesting show, but also once again. We're gonna get into some pretty complex topics. So yeah, first of all, Douglas, thank you once again for being part of the podcast and for being here to discuss some other interesting and very important and difficult aspects of the things that are going on in the world. And that have gone on in the ancient past, so shall I say. So,
well, thank you so much. It's always an honor to come on your show, Francisco. So it's really great to be back on here with you. And yeah, I've been looking forward to having this discussion with you, and done quite a bit of preparation to prepare for it. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit more of a difficult show and advanced in a sense, but we're going to endeavor here to make it as accessible to laity as possible. But I'm going to speak some of these things very directly and in hopes that it can be understood, or that the advanced student that wants to go further in their learning can it's always an appeal to those that can to take this farther. And but yeah, I don't want to limit myself by trying to make it accessible to laity, but some of these topics will be advanced, and I'm going to be endeavoring to speak them directly in some cases. So I just wanted to kind of caveat it with that. But yeah, it's great to be back on here with you.
Yeah. So before we start going, getting deep into the subject matter, just wanted to say that this whole topic of religion, it's not really very well understood, even by those who are questioning the institutional religions, and I for what I've seen, oftentimes it happens that people tend to consider it, one of the main problem, if not the main problem in our world, religious, religions and religious type thinking, and it sure is. However, with what we are going to do today, we're gonna attempt to go. We're gonna do what I think should be done, to go further into it, to understand its origins and its roots, and to really grasp the meaning of it all, basically, as best we can. There's a lot of like Bible burning attitude, if you catch my meaning there.
Absolutely.
People see that religion is a problem today, and they wanna like go to the other, to completely disregard it or cancel it or eliminate it without doing the necessary study on it, which is actually quite fundamental and key to do. So
yeah, I agree. We have to be careful. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the baby has the link to our past. And the baby has the link to the origins of the pure forms before they became dogmatic. So let's start out by just I'm thinking of the Richard Weatherwill book, Be Right or Go Wrong. So we have a language barrier. We have a limitation with ambiguity in the language. And of course, we have different cultural languages, which also creates a tremendous diversity. In fact, language and alphabet itself can be considered to be the Tower of Babel, the fall of the Tower of Babel, because the diversification of the language is part of a communication barrier that we're faced with. But it's all about, being right and building on sound foundations. So we have to know how to understand and arrive at truth. And we're aware that there's a limitation in the modern education, not teaching the students how to critically think, and rather and just teaching them what to think and how to be obedient and servile. But it's all about being right. So let's try to define the word religion and understand that this ambiguity leads to building on unsound foundations. So we gotta know what the fundamentals are, and we have to know how to discover truth, and we have to be able to discern things that we can know without the appeal to authority. And there's several discernments that we're going to need to make that hopefully we'll be fleshing out as we go forward through this. But the word religion and its derivations, you see, there's even ambiguity here, but let's just say from the Latin religare, means to tie back or to bind to, in the Latin religare, which can be cited as the origin for the word religion. Now, in the sense of tying back or binding back, it could mean that it's holding us back from growth in consciousness and stagnating our evolutionary growth through stagnating our learning and our ability to progress in the evolution of consciousness. But in the positive sense, it could be to bind back to truth. So in that sense, it would be positive because it's binding us back to that which cannot be altered or changed, and needs to be rather understood and then, aligned with. Also, the word religio and the word relegate. The religio also is to bind or to tie back, or no, the relegate is to bind or tie back. These words are also seen as part of the etymology of the word, but not necessarily. So my take on it is that it's about understanding truth, and truth in the sense of the cause of causality. So we can get into the ambiguity of atheism and God and what God is, but I think it's best defined as the source or the cause of causes. And Manly P. Hall said something very profound. He said ignorance is being unaware that human behavior has consequences. So part of what we're trying to do when we talk about ignorance, we're talking about, not really being ignorant of rocket science so much as ignorance denotes being ignorant of the fact that our behaviors have consequences. So we have free will, but we don't have free will without consequences.
Yes.
And we need to understand the physical laws in nature as best that we can, which can be quantified. So when we're talking about physics or quantum physics or even biology and chemistry, physics all the way down to mathematics, these things can be quantified. And in general, the sciences that deal with them are empirical. The problem with that is empirical science ignores unseen forces. And science today, it attempts to quantify, let's say, gravity, but it really has not defined or pinpointed the source of what gravity is. And that's just an example of one of these hidden laws that we can better understand because we can see its direct effects in the physical world. So the Newtonian paradigm is partly based on that, but it's empirical in the sense that it deals with quantifying things and deals with, in order for something to be objective, there has to be an object. This is empirical science. The dilemma in that is that it ignores unseen forces. So let's just say this word religion from the Latin religare is either, to tie back. It doesn't mean to reread. The religio is to reread, and then to relegate is to bind to. But the real source of the word religion is religare, and it contains both of those meanings in it. So we need to understand it in the positive and negative sense. It contains the meaning to tie back or to bind to.
Yes.
So in the sense that it's holding us back from conscious evolution, that would be negative. But in the sense that it's binding us back to truth through the consequences that we experience by wrong behavior that's driven by wrong thinking, therein lies the dilemma. So this is what we have to understand. And we have to understand that in the ancient world, the elders could not afford the luxury of dogma, which is erroneous thinking. They could not afford the luxury of being wrong and living in a proxy world. And so everything was contingent upon being right and knowing that which is correct, and then how to align ourselves to it. So part of the stigma around religion is we have to understand that in its purest origins is a truth discovery method, and that it created a body of knowledge that is not only the most important body of knowledge to man's survival as a species, but it's a body of knowledge that took the longest to develop and understand, and then methods to be able to develop and understand, to teach and pass that knowledge forward generationally. And then once that had been compromised, it leads to a period of nescience that has really only emerged from this nescience, in my view, in the last, less than 100 years or so. Basically at the beginning of the 20th century, that was possible to aggregate enough knowledge into one place to do the comparative cultural study to understand what has ubiquity and trace that ubiquity back to its origins. So this is what we're dealing with here. And there's a lot of ways that I could come at this. I'm trying to make it as easy for us to be able to understand. But this idea of throwing the baby out with the bathwater is this is what leads to this cancel culture. And then we have to understand that by the time the human species had embraced socialism, which I want to define that term too, which is man's authority, man's law, and man's punishment coercively imposed on the population. So I'll define socialism as, the idea that no matter what problem the human species would be faced with the socialist mindset, then control is the answer. That's what socialism really is. This is where we get the idea that man can be the authority, man can impose punishment, man can enforce law, and that man's law is the highest order in the universe. And the exact opposite is true, because the need to control the extant is actually an action based in fear. And any action based in fear, when we understand the natural law, leads to chaos. So this and you can learn this in basic relationships, even if you just live with somebody. If you're living with somebody and you try to take over the environment and control everything, see what happens. You're going to be met with chaos. So this need to control is an action based in fear. So if we arrest our development there, that we're going to solve problems with control, then we're not only actually manifesting chaos in the world, but we're also arresting our development to expand our own mental capacities to do better and engage our imagination to find a better way. So that, there's a lot of issues that come up with that we got to understand it from that perspective. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's ironic how because of the fear of chaos, we actually advocate, that type of control, that type of total control, by men, onto us, because we are afraid of, we fear that otherwise it's gonna be chaotic, when instead it's quite the contrary.
And that's because we don't understand the natural law. We don't understand that an action based in fear manifests the chaos. Okay, so I'm defining socialism as, no matter what man's problem is, control is the answer. That's what the socialist mindset is. And the fallacy of that thinking is that the control is driven by fear, and any action based in fear in the natural law actually causes the chaos. And and there's a lot to say about that, how this manifests, and what the result that we're getting is a bad result as a result of this. So this is what we're going to try to be getting down to. So in order to understand how dogma came into the world, which is erroneous thinking or fallacious thinking, we really have to go all the way back to the origins. So when we go back to the origins, it's going to sound to many like we're trying to ascribe a new religion, when in fact I'm telling you that we're not getting out of this without understanding this, because what we're dealing with is a failure in the priest class. And because we have a failure in the priest class, the human dilemma is not just knowledge being sequestered and hidden from humanity. It's that these hidden laws in nature, for man to discover and develop, and then develop the methods to teach, is the largest body of knowledge that's ever existed. And that it took hundreds of thousands of years to develop and understand it. And then once we had strayed so far from source, it no longer could be understood. So negligence is part of the dilemma that we have. It's not just that the knowledge is being hidden and sequestered away from us. It's that to understand these things, the truth is sublime. The truth is subtle. So if we want to just say, oh, they're hiding the knowledge from me, what we're really trying to do is abdicate our personal responsibility to take up the mantle of this failure in this priest class. So we have to understand that the straying from source is part of the dilemma, and the changing of ideographic types in the original expression is part of the dilemma.
Yeah.
And that it's a failure in the priest class, where we've gone into what I call the greater mysteries. And having gone into the greater mysteries, we've strayed so far from what's called the lesser mysteries. They're not lesser in importance, but they're the original mysteries that deal with principles, and they're about temperance and responsibility. So part of the dilemma is that we've strayed so far from source, even the priest class no longer understood pure forms. So when you're straying from pure forms, these are the simpler fundamental forms. And then when we go into the greater mysteries, we're going into complex forms. So the whole stigma around the complex forms is it's stigmatized because we're dealing with complex forms when we can't even understand the fundamentals. And then we get these things that you can call incantations. And there doesn't even have to be any real science in an incantation. All it has to be is a complex form that somebody else does not understand, and then they're confronted by their own ignorance, which results or which is the manifestation as confronting the fear of darkness. And that's our most primal fear. Like in Michael Ayer's dispatches, he described real accounts of the Vietnam War and how the soldiers were coming back from having been on a tour of duty in combat, saying that the things that they imagined coming out of the blackness of the jungle were 1,000 times more terrifying than anything that ever actually did. And of course we know that the atrocities were unbearable in that war. But the point I'm trying to make is your imagination would make those things thousands of times even more terrifying, because we're confronting our own fear of darkness, and that's what the ignorance that we're faced with is. So these complex forms that we find in the greater mysteries, they don't even have to have any truth in them if it comes right down to it. You could just scare the hell out of somebody by presenting them with something that they don't understand. And what I'm saying is, having gone into the greater mysteries and then neglecting the lesser mysteries, which deal with outlining principles and the fundamental foundations and temperance that we need to build on. Those are the pure forms, which are simple forms. And once we go into the greater mysteries, which are complex forms, we're not going to be able to deal with it. It's would be akin to like a kid who's wielding his dad's loaded gun. And it's a threat to everybody, So that's one thing that we have to understand, is that the true adversary is ignorance. That's what we're faced with, is ignorance. And we talked about the Manly P. Hall definition. Ignorance is not understanding that human behavior has consequences, which means it's governed by law. And we're not talking about man's law. We're talking about the hidden forces in nature. Now, H.A. Giles, the Chinese scholar, he says in his opening caveat that the Chinese scholars never really had any trouble understanding that the great monad had divided into two, into duality, and that we were dealing with a feminine and a masculine principle. So this internal androgyny, this internal chemical wedding of the masculine and the feminine forces is the most important part of the great work on the individual level. We have to bring both of those forces into balance on the internal in order for us to manifest right action in the external. So not understanding that, we get the inversion of that, which is externalized androgyny. And now you can see that's a real dilemma that we're facing now as a species. And it's being used to promote transgenderism, transhumanism, and ideally, Marxism and communist or fascist idealism.
Yes.
It's all being used to bolster man's claim to authority, man's claim that he knows what's best for everybody. And the problem with that is we're going to try to abdicate our responsibility for the idea that somebody else is more qualified and more benevolent and more philanthropic than we ourselves are. And I want to just refer us to the Tolkien epic of Lord of the Rings, when Gandalf tells Frodo, if you don't do it, no one will. And that's the attitude everybody needs to take, because the fact is, it's a failure in the priest class. So we've gone into the greater mysteries. We've gone into complex forms. We have a failure in the priest class. And the cause of that is several factors, but negligence is a huge factor. Straying from source is a huge factor. And changing ideographic types in the early expression of man and the sign language and symbol is a huge factor. And then, of course, man's ambition, materialistic ambition to dominate and control is a factor. But all of those things are important factors. So the idea that the Vatican's going to open the vaults in the Vatican and make that accessible to humanity is not a real solution, because humanity would not be able to understand what they were looking at anyway without the dedicated study and scientific research that few, if any, have undertaken. So we have to understand, because it's a failure in the priest class, and because these other factors are part of it, which include straying from source, changing ideographic types, negligence, and then man's materialistic ambition to dominate and control. And then also we have the ignorant masses storming the temples, demanding a PhD, forcing the knowledge out into the light of day, and murdering all the learned men through this cancel culture. We've actually isolated ourselves. But the point I'm trying to make is that because it's a failure in the priest class, small thinking will not serve us anymore. If it ever did, it won't now, because what that amounts to is now every individual, it's always been true that every individual has the responsibility to aspire and learn truth, and understand, these hidden laws in nature. But also, it's a responsibility that we've never been able to give away. But because we have this failure in this priest class, the responsibility now rests firmly on everybody's shoulders.
Yes,
so that's what I'm trying to say there. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, well, I wanted to say that because it's a failure in the priest class, we in a priest class we can't expect another priest class, in particular the current, to solve our problem for us. If anything, they're actually capitalizing on it. So,
and compounding it. Now, the idea of faith is not necessarily a bad thing, because it is the belief in a higher power than man. But this faithism, as we've seen, and this phenomenon in the monotheism, the belief in this sky daddy and this anthropomorphized, monotheistic deity, creates an ambiguity in the what the creator, or whatever you want to call it, actually is. So we have a dilemma in the language. The ambiguity of the language is a barrier. Not just cultural diversity in language, but language itself is the fall of the Tower of Babel, because it represents a degradation in the original expression of sign language, which is symbol, gesture, ceremony, ritual, dance, and even phonetics. But see, the alphabetization and the diversity, the cultural diversity in language, is also a barrier. But the primary barrier is that we've reduced the symbol to a mundane phonetic variant. And the same is true in the allegorical oral traditions, where the original allegorical teaching, like the idea that Jesus spoke in parables, but not to riddle us into confusion, to face us with the fact that both hemispheres of the brain have to be fully engaged to understand this sublime information where the universe is always speaking, but we can't understand its message because we don't know how to read the way that the universe expresses. The ambiguous or the language is a barrier because, oh yeah, the storytelling or the allegorical oral tradition and the parables and such have reduced, or because we have a decline in understanding the symbolism, the allegorical symbolic expression has been reduced to mundane storytelling. So this is partly why the stories in the Bible and other religious texts, and even in the fables and the fairy tales and the folklore, are very important. And we don't want to throw those babies out with the bathwater either, because in those there's threads of ubiquity that will be found when we do the comparative study. So if we throw those babies out with the bathwater, we're further isolating ourselves. Ultimately, we can completely end up cutting ourselves off from the past. Once we do that, there is no hope. So the only hope that we have is that we still have enough information to trace it back to source. And having, according to the research that I've done, I'm here to tell you the good news is it still can be done. And the good news is there is a creator. However, the bad news is that there is a creator, because that means you still have the same responsibility now to understand truth. And it's a tremendous responsibility because, it's compounded by this dogmatic priest class and these dogmatic religions. On a recent show, actually on the show that you did with Nate Cap, it was a great show, and really liked what you guys were talking about. You guys did a terrific job explaining some of these things. But Nathan brought up the 24-inch gauge as a measure of time. And that's very important, because this is not about being a slave to the truth, but it is about understanding that our free will only ultimately will serve us to discover through prudence and error what the natural law is, and then how we can align ourselves to it. Because part of the free will is to, first we have to arrive at understanding truth, and then we still have the free will to accept it or reject it. I'm thinking of the Soren Kierkegaard quote. There are two ways that people can be fooled. One is by accepting things that are not true, and the other is to, or believing in things that are not true, and the other is to reject the things that are true. So we have to be careful with that, and understand that we have this free will, and understand, or being able to understand what the truth is a serious endeavor. And once we get all the way to the top of that mountain, we still have the free will to reject it and refuse to accept it. So you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can lead a student to truth, but you can't make them think. So it is an individual responsibility that it comes down to. And regarding the 24-inch gauge, the way that Nathan described it, I would corroborate. And I thought it was a brilliant dissertation on his part. And he described it that it was divided into three, as in, 24 hours of the day divided into three, which is basically meant for us to have the 8 hours of rest to be able to function properly. It doesn't mean you need 8 hours of sleep, but it does mean that you need 8 hours of downtime. And, it probably at least 4 to 6 hours of sleep. But you need 8 hours where you're not engaged in your personal labors and you're not engaged in the labors of the great work. So divided into 3, that leaves us 8 hours to rest, 8 hours to commit to the great work, and 8 hours for, fun and play and whatever else we want to do. But because we have a compounded problem and a failure in the priest class, we can't afford to cut into our time to rest, or we won't be able to function properly. Maybe we can take a couple hours out of that, but ideally, we're always going to need that downtime. So, unfortunately, because we've allowed this problem to compound so long, we are going to have to devote some of our playtime to the serious work, which many hands make light work, but because so few understand this now, and we're so deep in this dilemma, we're going to have to on an individual level, commit ourselves to solving that problem. And what does it take to move men to truth? Well, the 3,000 years of human history that we have has been nothing but war and famine and pestilence. And that doesn't seem to have been enough to move men to truth. So what does it take to move men to truth? And I could sit here and tell you some things that I understand about this control paradigm that would literally scare the hell out of you. And it should scare the hell out of you what they're endeavoring to do, because, they don't really have our best interest as a species in mind.
The scary thought is that we are going in the direction that the ancients were really trying to warn us about, and actually trying to attempt to teach us and to leave a record for future generations, in order not to go in this direction, in the direction of socialism, total control, and absolute pragmatism, and the disregard for the truth. Consider it like a secondary, if not even not even worse than that, like consider it of basically little to no importance, or that it doesn't even exist. So unfortunately, that's the realization I had on the matter.
I agree, and that's what we're talking about.
We are doing
the
contrary, the exact contrary of what we were supposed to.
Right, that's right. We're completely upside down in our thinking, and the result is our behaviors are manifesting the syntropic or the entropic force that breaks things down.
Yeah, and it goes back to understanding what we were saying about consequences. This among other things, this is actually one of the most difficult things that I try to explain sometimes to people. Actually, understanding the law of cause and effect. Actually, it seems pretty logical, but we really haven't got a good grasp on it.
That's right. It needs to be understood at a much deeper, fundamental level.
Yes.
And we're still talking about the origins of religion, and before I'm trying to get into that, I'm still trying to caveat this, that in its earliest phase, it was about truth discovery.
Yeah, because even their survival depended on it. They couldn't, they literally couldn't stray away from the truth, or civilizations, past civilization would have perished.
That's correct. And and I want to point out here that when we're talking about evolution, we're not talking about Darwinian evolution. We're talking about the evolution that is caused by man applying his ability to reason, and how that leads to a more complex type or a higher type, because we're activating synaptic pathways in the brain that actually makes up a more complex system, as a being. We're becoming more sophisticated in our complexity by engaging in more complex ideas, and also harmonizing with truth and understanding truth requires that we have achieved of this, or this internal androgyny, this internal androgynous state, where we can actually receive the higher knowledge. And there's a lot to it. So we'll begin breaking down some of that here in a minute. But I wanted to caveat this with where we currently are as a species. So the current human condition is covert slavery, and it is dictated and run by a technocratic occultocracy. So what do I mean by that? They're using technology for means of control. So everything that they're giving us technologically that makes our lives more convenient, or seems to make things more convenient or more accessible to more people, is actually a false gift, because everything is backdoored for control. So that technology and modern science is not the savior we've been waiting for. Arriving in the technological age is driven and compelled by the need for utility. So the need for utility is also partly driven by us straying from our natural habitat, which is about, not more than 15 degrees north or south of the equator, which means if the human species strays more than 15 degrees north or south of the equator, we're going into an inhospitable climate where we cannot survive without utility, which means, shelter, food, and safety and protection. And, the farther we stray from the natural habitats, the less we can rely on having a year-round source of crops, and that we can only plant at certain times during the year. So we can't hypothetically make it through the winter exclusively on a vegetarian diet. And then it forces the need for carnism. It also forces the need for clothing, which leads to fur trapping and taking dominating animals in nature for their furs and other resources. And that's part of this dilemma, is what I'm trying to say. But this technocratic occultocracy they're using technology. So the technology that makes our lives more convenient is a false gift, because it's being used and backdoored for control. Anybody that hasn't figured out that this 2020 crisis that we've had nothing to do with health, it's about a total omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient control system, and to force us into the Chinese model of the social credit system that was incubated there, where they want to build these smart cities and give you a 15-minute zone that you can't go outside of without their permission. And they can bolster people's dependency on their control by creating artificial scarcity, like rolling blackouts and things like that, to remind us that we won't be able to survive without them. And ideally, you're probably not going to be able to access the internet much longer without a federal ID and all of your, updated medical criteria based on what they prescribe as, necessary for you to have this ID. So you won't be able to avoid whatever they want to impose on us without being completely shut out of society through this digital medium. And they've gotten everybody dependent on this, where we practically couldn't even imagine life without it now. And it's about to be stripped away from us without full compliance. So we need to understand, and it's an occultocracy in the sense that, the word occult means hidden, but also occult means sublime, like I talked about. It's not just hidden, it's sublime information too, and not easily accessible. Not to confuse it with esoteric, but it's similar. But it's an occultocracy in the sense that they're using hidden knowledge or sublime knowledge and keeping that sequestered away from us or dissuading us from being able to understand it. And in that sense, it's a ruling class of which you'll never know the names of the real dark occultists, if you will. But it's a ruling class of psychology, of dark psychologists that know more about the human psyche than the average population, and they know more about us than we know about ourselves. So they know how to manipulate us and pull all of our strings to get us to behave the way that they want to. So that's what I mean when I say it's a technocratic occultocracy, and that they're moving us rapidly into this social credit system. Well, money is mammon, and mammon is a proxy. And we can't serve two masters, God and mammon being money, or government for that matter, because both those things represent a proxy world. Right now, money, we've become so dependent on money, it's our last vestige of freedom. So if we were to actually end cash, we would be compromising our last vestige of free market and open markets, because they would be able to digitally track, not only be able to digitally track and control every single transaction, but they could also just completely cancel you as, and cancel you financially with the push of a button. So we have to understand how dangerous that prospect is. Ideally, we do need to emerge in consciousness to where, we don't need a monetary system, but we're nowhere near that now. And right now, the cash would be our last vestige of freedom. So we better be careful with that.
Yeah, I agree.
And we have to understand that ideally, we need to rise high enough in consciousness that we understand that even barter is a proxy system that can lead to, hoarding and fear of lack and domination, if you will.
Oh, yes.
And part of the reason for that is because this ignorance is concerning not understanding what rights are. And the only way we can understand what rights are is by understanding that all rights are based on property rights. So we have to understand this term property and what it actually means. And I'm just going to give us a brief explanation of property. Basically, it means that which you are in possession of was attained through legitimate means, and that you have a legitimate right to be in possession of it. Number two, you're in stewardship of it and are able to maintain by your own means. You're able to maintain this property. And then three, that you've taken responsibility for the liability of the property, and you've taken responsibility for the care and stewarding and ownership of this property. So people are so confused about property right now, they don't even understand that their body is their property. And we have to understand this full spectrum dominance, this government, has already shown you its true colors. It wants to go inside your body, which is a total disregard for property and human rights. And every government that's been engaged in this, which is all of them, is engaged in crimes against humanity and needs to be held accountable immediately. And we're so close to the precipice of them getting this thing in place. We don't have much time to get this figured out. So I want to put some emphasis on that and understand that this was a globally coordinated effort on the part of all these governments. So it's a global program of a global government. So your ideas of borders and all of this and all these different countries is completely illusory on your part. Those days are over. The world is a corporation, and the corporations have grown up around the governments. And this was clearly a coordinated global endeavor, which denotes and clearly exemplifies that we are living under a global government, and that the only difference, that there was any difference in the United States than any other place in the world, is because that's the only place in the world that still has the Second Amendment, or the right to bear arms, or the right to defend itself against tyrannical government. So we better understand that's not about hunting rights. It's about being able to preserve sovereignty, as a means of, as a contingency for tyranny. And that's what we're facing. We're facing a medical tyranny under bio warfare and bio psi war, which is a psychological operation. So we're being hit on every front. So we don't have a lot of time to get this figured out. So, and this phenomenon of order following is part of this problem. So I'm going to caveat this by saying order followers, the military and police, have been responsible for every genocide in the history of the human race. And it's the idea that you can abdicate personal responsibility to make choices, and that you are somehow abdicating your karmatic effect for making those choices, which is completely erroneous, because the order followers are always going to get the brunt of that karma, because they are more morally culpable than the order giver. Say that, and that'll make you the life of the party, but it's the truth. So we have to understand that. Whoever takes the action is more culpable. I'm not saying that those that are giving the orders from a position of authority don't have culpability, but they're using the order followers to buffer themselves off from it. And if we look at the Milgram experiments and the Stanford studies, the Milgram experience dealt with an unbridled, unquestioning belief in the religion of authority, because religion we've defined as erroneous thinking in its malevolent form. And then the Stanford studies dealt with how somebody in authority escalates the need to be abusive and justifies that under the guise that makes them more effective and less likely to be confrontational. So the idea is, if they act more tyrannical or more brutal, that they'll attain or acquire more compliance as a result. But the truth of the matter is, they just become more and more abusive, and then the atrocities compound, and they do more and more and more harm against humanity. So this belief in authority is one of the central problems, and it is a religion. It's erroneous thinking, and it's the arrestment of our development that we can do better. And we're throwing that baby out with the bathwater by ascribing to the religion of authority and trying to abdicate our responsibility, and we're limiting our imagination by doing that. So that leads to moral relativism, and ultimately social Darwinism, and then eugenics. The idea that somebody has the right to decide who lives and who dies, and who is superior to others, and who is a burden on society, etc. Those are all very, very dangerous ideologies, and they are the cause of the suffering in this world. So we have to understand that.
Yeah, so I think understanding objective morality and what it is and what it is not is part of the and what and especially what consequences derive from not aligning with it and not understanding it, or disregard it.
That's right. Yeah, let's address that right now. This is one of the hidden laws. This is part of natural law. What we can call the law of freedom, or the law of morality. And basically it is this: as morality declines, freedom declines. So that basically is the law of freedom, or the law of objective morality. The law of freedom and the law of objective morality is, as morality declines, freedom declines. And the loss of freedom is the limiting of choices that we could otherwise have the freedom to be able to make. So this is how we observe the effects the effects in the physical world manifesting is in terms of loss of freedom. So to understand objective morality and karma, understanding karma is part of this too, because we're talking about consequences of human behavior.
Oh yeah, I wanted to say those are measure. It's actually a very measurable and observable phenomenon. It's not that it's unseen. It's actually it's actually visible.
It is visible, but it's not instantaneous like
Yes.
the Hollywood variant that you take a bad action and an anvil falls on your head, or
you've got to have an ample view, of how this reality works.
Right, and that only comes through the effort of expanding our consciousness. That's what consciousness is the awareness of what's taking place both internally and externally. So this is why a lot of people can't see it, is because they haven't done that inner work. They don't really understand how this karma works. And karma is an Eastern Oriental word that found its way into the English dictionary, but it basically means that our behaviors have consequences, and as we sow, so shall we reap. So in that sense, it's related to agriculture, and we're going to talk about that. But we are not dealing with punishment per se. We are not dealing with a condition after death or in life which evil forces take over the light of consciousness of human beings. We are not relating to demonology nor to Hades populated by ghosts and monsters. The word karma is simply a term to signify the effects inherent in their causes. And scientifically, this would probably not be seriously disputed. But the idea is that as we reap, or as we sow, so shall we reap. We reap what we sow. And then we want to go back and deal with this idea of the law of freedom, which deals with objective morality, understanding that the same bad behavior is basically going to produce the same result every time in terms of loss of freedom. So, thinking of the Richard Wetherwell, be right or go wrong. But it's also about building on sound foundations. And not understanding this is where we get this idea of entities. So I wanted to talk about entities in the sense that if we imagine that entities are living beings that live in another dimension, then we're actually extracting ourselves from this dimension. The other dimension is happening in the collective psyche. It's happening on the individual level and in the collective psyche. And these entities are basically recesses of the human psyche that are undealt with shadow work. The idea that we're allowing the demons in ourselves to justify bad behavior in the extant. So we can succumb to the entity in the sense that we're really just succumbing to our own ego or our own refusal of truth, which leaves us in a vulnerable position to allow the undeveloped parts of our brain to operate the individual in the physical sense, or in the physical engagement in the physical world. So I wanted to just try to put a better definition on this idea of entities, and say that entities are actually part of, the idea of external entities that we can be affected by. What that really is, in fact, is a proxy world. And that proxy world is the result of believing in man's authority, or the religion of authority. We're entering into the corporate world. and hence the word corpse. It's the land of the dead. This is what this proxy world gives us, this idea that we can have somebody else represent our best interests. This is what leads us into this proxy world, and the idea of, money is part of that proxy world, because money is an instrument that represents a denomination of a financial value. And that also is a proxy world. And in relation to the word anarchy, which is a Greek term, in Greek you had the 9 archons, and those represented basically a body of the state, which is a proxy. So this idea of anarchy is more than just no masters and no slaves, which I'm wholeheartedly in agreement with. We do not want to live with live in a world with anything that creates master-slave relationships, and we don't need coercive authority over the individual to bring out the best behavior in the individual. And we'll talk about leadership too. I want to define leadership right now. Leadership is a little bit more complex, but in general, we can boil it down to 2 types of leadership, transactional and transformational. Transactional leadership is essentially what's known as carrot and stick approach, which really translates to punishment and reward. And I wanted to say that all forms of coercive government operate on that modus operandi. If you do good, then you get rewarded. If you do bad, then you get punished. That's a transactional form of leadership. And, we find it in some of the dogma, like Santa Claus. We're going to find out who's naughty and nice. And if you're not good, then Santa's not going to bring you any presents for Christmas. That's transactional leadership in the sense. Or, it's based on transactional leadership. Ideally, in its pure form, would be based on natural law. And when I say natural law, that has nothing to do with animal behavior in the animal kingdom. Natural law applies to the beings that have the mental capacity to discern that which is right from that which is wrong, or knowing truth from falsehood. So, back to this word entities and anarchy. Anarchy also means no proxies. It means we cannot afford to live in a proxy world with anything that creates master-slave relationship or master-slave relationships, or anything that acts as a stand-in representation of the genuine article. This is part of what the ancients understood. They could not afford to live in a world of dogma, and part of that dogma is believing that we can live in a proxy world, which we cannot afford to. Because what that does is that leads us farther away from the truth. And we can't afford to go down that path, because we can go so far down that path, which is where we are essentially now, we may not be able to find our way home. So ideally, it is a spiritual lesson. History doesn't repeat itself, and we're not trapped in these cycles of time where the golden age is going to revolve back around. That's only going to be affected by growth in consciousness. So it's not that history repeats itself. It's that if we don't learn the same mistake, or if we don't learn from our mistake, we're going to get the same lesson all over again. And each time, we're progressing in our technology and our capability to dominate and control things. So it's going to get more and more severe until it's trial by fire. And the alternative to learning trial by fire is learning by observation. So, you don't have to be Aleister Crowley to go learn the mysteries, but you could study his work and learn some of the pitfalls and perils of delving into the world of the occult without having to go out and make some of the same mistakes that he, as an example, may have made and learn the hard way. You can watch somebody else, put their hand on a hot stove and get burned rather than going and sticking your hand on there and getting the trial by fire. You could learn by observation. So we want to be clear on that.
Yeah,
And
because you might not come back from that mistake you make. So
that's right. The consequences could be more severe for one person than they could be for another. But as a species,
yeah, as a species too.
Yeah, as a species too. That's right. But as a species, I'm talking about this phenomenon of entities and the idea of entities. The problem I would have with that is anything that allows us to play the role of the victim is not really in line with truth. I'm not saying that there's no such thing as a victim, but I'm saying that in spite of all of our hardships and all of the trauma that we're faced with, part of the spiritual lesson is understanding the power of the human will, and that we don't really know what we're capable of until we try, and we don't know how much we're abdicating our personal responsibility until we refuse to do so. So the idea is not that history repeats itself, it's that if we don't learn from the lesson, then we get to the lesson all over again, and we're getting closer and closer to the precipice of the point of no return. So I wanted to mention that, and then the idea of anarchy doesn't just mean no masters and no slaves. It also means no archons, which means we cannot afford to live in a proxy corporate world and have this so-called representation.
I agree. I agree with that consideration on anarchy. Yeah, it's quite an interesting point of view, that of archons and proxism. What do you say? Shall we get into some of the aspects of religion's origins or roots?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're going to try to do now. And this is going to sound a little bit different in the rhetoric, so let me try to bring this in for us. First of all, we're never going to understand origins until we get out of this tiny box that we've been put in of this 3,000 to 6,000 year history, primarily coming from Abraham doctrines and the classical history that we have in academia. These are both terrible fallacies that we're going to have to overcome. What we need to understand in its purest forms can only be found in the Nile Valley. And the Nile Valley is basically what I refer to as Egypt. And the Nile Valley is 4,000 miles long, and it's sourced at the Great Lakes of Central Africa, which flows north all the way to the Mediterranean Sea and the delta of the Nile. So we have to understand that the laws of nature and objective morality were discovered in the remotest antiquity on the banks of the Nile River, and that everything that these cultures had been endeavoring to do from that point forward was finding ways to preserve this knowledge even in their most primitive forms of expression. But one of the ironies about the early form of expression, which is symbol and sign language, is that it actually, even though it is a primitive form of our ability to express, ideally is a more advanced form of our expression, because it requires that both hemispheres of the brain be engaged, whereas language is more of a left brain prospect, and it has more of appeal to the ego. So that's important to understand. But part of the dilemma that we're faced with in modernity is that we don't understand the natural law, but we also don't understand culture. And I'm seeing that the lack of understanding of culture as more and more imperative as part of this dilemma. So I'm going to try to help explain culture today. And I wanted to say that, part of understanding culture is understanding what the culture is endeavoring to do, that which it is endeavoring or putting its time and attention into achieving. So the only way we're really going to be able to understand these ancient cultures is by understanding what they're endeavoring to do and why it's so important to them. And that this idea that our earliest expression is symbol and sign language, that's because they didn't have the words to explain these things at that time. But the irony is, or the paradox is that while it is a primitive form of expression, in a sense, it's closer to the way that the universe speaks and the way that we can understand and read the language of the birds and understand how the universe is speaking, but also that it's a higher potential for our own ability to express. You know, like say mundane storytelling versus or an allegorical story that has a moral teaching contained within it. That is more complex than just a mundane story, you know. And that's what's been compromised through this lack of understanding the symbolism and the sign language. So there's a lot of things to understand, and where we're going to start is by understanding that we got to get out of this tiny box, because the truth that we're going to attempt to unfold will never fit inside that box. And you know, the fact that one of the horrifying facts of the matter is that not only have we lost our true human story and our true human history, and the greatest portion of that story is that, you know, where the classical history picks up is very late in the game, and that the Hebrews had taken from Babylon what was already a corrupted Egyptian in remote antiquity, and the Hebrews had taken what was already a corruption Egyptian from Babylon and brought us Abraham doctrines by which scholars have perpetuated into modernity. So that's part of what this dilemma is these Abraham doctrines from which all these major exoteric religions, primarily Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, are derived from.
So you're talking about a timeline, right? Time periods. When you say the tiny box that we are.
That's right. Yeah, we have this tiny box paradigm of 3,000 to 6,000 years of human history, and I'm trying to explain that that's very late in the game, and that the corruption had happened, you know, even anterior to dynastic Egypt. In Egypt, and there's a lot to that story. So we got to get out of that tiny box was my main point, because I'm going to lay out somewhat of a timeline here so we can at least have a better perspective on how much time we need to be dealing with. And what we're partly talking about here is the evolution, not Darwinian evolution, but the evolution that is caused by man's applying his ability to reason, because that's what leads to a more sophisticated type and more sophisticated technology and more sophisticated idealism. And that's what actually creates a higher type and causes the evolution to occur in consciousness, which causes the evolution or the creation of a more complex being. So that is actually what is evolving us from the point where man applies reason. So we're not talking about Darwinian evolution. And when we use the term natural law, we're not talking about Darwinian survival of the fittest in the animal kingdom. We're talking about the laws that apply to the beings that have the capacity to understand principles and the difference between objective morality and truth from falsehood. So anyway, we got to get out of that box and trace religion all the way back to its roots. We have to go all the way back to the totemic sociology. And that predates religion, you know. But in the totemic sociology, they begin to discover and recognize the elemental powers. So at the point where they begin to recognize the elemental powers, which are forces in nature that affect the physical reality that we have to live in, and that could be, you know, storm. And storm is a big subject because that could define many things, you know, earthquakes, any weather phenomenon, drought, you know, earthquake, storm, thunderstorm, rainstorm, lightning storm, volcano. You know, these are.
Isn't that from where the dragon symbolism originates? Like the
dragon symbolism, yeah, it is actually the oldest of the ideas in the early understanding of these principles in nature. It's about
it's both the storm and the drought, right?
Well, I would say, yeah, it's the rain and the drought.
Okay.
Or it's the centropic force and the entropic force. It's dealing with duality in its original form. And because the Oriental people, the Japanese and Chinese, they actually represent an early exodus out of Egypt in the early stages of the hero cult in the stellar phase. So that's one reason why the dragon is so prevalent in their cultural traditions. But the dragon myth is the oldest of the mythology. And it's dealing with duality. So there's a good dragon and a bad dragon, so to speak. And this predates the idea of Horus and Set even. But it's the earliest. But see, this is in the totemic sociology. And in the totemic sociology, they begin to understand these elemental powers. And then they typically the elemental powers are grouped into a group of 7. You know, with storm being one of the 7, but see, storm can be expounded upon because storm can be broken down into volcano. So when the volcano rumbles, that's the dragon inside the volcano, you know, getting stirred up and things like that. But, you know, the storm alone could be expounded on. It could mean drought, rain. You know, the hot, arid wind is the breath of the dragon. You know, so a fire drake from the north is a northern hot, dry wind.
Yes.
You know, like in the Tolkien, the fire drake of the north, you know, is the hot, dry, arid wind of the north. And then these things become literalized, and then the principal teachings become obscured and then ultimately lost. So in the earliest phase of the mythology, we do have the dragon myth. And that deals largely with polarity and understanding these two opposing forces of the entropic and syntropic force. The syntropic force being that which causes growth, and the entropic force which causes things to break down. And understanding that that's part of the balance of the nature of this world. But in the totemic sociology, they begin to understand and venerate elemental powers in a group of 7. So elemental powers are particularly ascribed to this number 7 in a group of 7. And first they begin to propitiate these elemental powers in 7. And then they begin to propitiate ancestry. Now this is the very point where we can say religion begins, because this is the point where they've basically exemplified that they believe in an everlasting soul. So the propitiation of ancestry is the point where religion actually begins, in the sense of the word, that we're dealing with a deity and an everlasting soul. And then they may make, you know, offerings in a ritual or a ceremony that are designated to assist or aid the soul on its journey through the underworld. and then successfully have another life resurrected on the other side. That's the idea of the perpetuation of ancestry, and then leaving an offering to aid the soul. Like he might get hungry on the way, so give him a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, leave that at the altar. But then when that becomes part of a meat diet, now we have animal sacrifice at the altar. And then when we leave like a symbol, like an ankh, now we have material at the altar. Now we make the ankh out of gold, and then the gold takes on an intrinsic financial value. Now we have something to be coveted at the altar. And now we have this coveting and this materialism, and that's how magic becomes fetishism. So we have to understand that this is how magic became fetishism. But I want to back us up. First, we propitiate elemental powers. Then we propitiate ancestry. That's the point where religion begins, because that's the point where we're exemplifying that we believe in this everlasting soul. Then we propitiate the one great spirit. So in that order, this is the very beginnings of religion in the totemic sociology. And then the totemic sociology from there moves into what we can call hero cult. And hero cult's a little bit difficult to understand and explain, but the best way to simplify it is understand in the hero cult, we're dealing with a cycle and a success story. And the idea of a savior or a savior complex would come from a corruption of this idea, because it's not really of so much of a physical prospect as is an internal journey of doing the shadow work and emerging triumphantly to reconnect or to connect to our higher self. So let me try to explain that a little bit. The eternal soul, one of the earliest words in the phonetic is the word Ka, Ka. So we're talking about the eternal soul. We're talking about the Ka. And what I wanted to suggest about the Ka is that, yes, we are all connected to the Creator from birth, but we're born in ignorance. So in order to distinguish our eternal soul from the mire, we have to raise out of the mire. So in order to establish the relationship with the Creator, we have to raise out of the mire and understand causality. And this is what natural law is. It's the science of causality. So the more we understand the natural law, the closer we are to the cause, which puts us closer proximity to the cause of causes, and that's what we can call the Creator. The problem with people having an aversion to words like God and Creator and what they call the ineffable name means that it can't be described by the limitations of any of our languages. All of the languages are limited and can never describe the full grandeur of the one great spirit. So by putting a label on it, we're limiting it. We're limiting its potential. So that's the danger with labeling. And this is part of the ambiguity and the contention when we talk about, I don't like the word God, or I don't want to call it the Creator. And I suggest that the best way to understand this, I use the word source and cause, or cause of causes. So that's part of what this is about. Yeah. So the Ka is the everlasting soul, and that we have to raise out of the mire of the generic type to a more sophisticated, higher type, a more complex internal chemical makeup that distinguishes us from that mire and leaves an indelible imprint on the universe. Because otherwise, you're just part of the mire. You're a generic type. But it's also about forging that relationship to your Creator. It's not about just saying, oh, I believe in the Creator, therefore I have a connection to the Creator. Yeah, you have a connection to the Creator. You are part of all that is. You are part of the creation. But you have no relationship to that Creator because that has to be earned in degree and merit. I'm not saying that you're cut off from Source, but I'm saying that the relationship is about understanding the Creator and then understanding this cause of causes, understanding what it cares about, understanding that it's the opposite of the entropic force, which also leads us to nothingness, and that the Creator represents somethingness, and that in order for us to distinguish ourselves from the mire, we have to raise out of that mire. The process of degree and raising in degree and merit in our understanding of the cause. The closer we get to the cause, the closer and closer proximity we are to this idea of this Creator. So that relationship that we're talking about is impersonal, and it has to be earned. So the more we understand the cause, the more we are in closer proximity to this Creator. And that ought to help explain, why partly people want to abdicate that responsibility, because they don't want to be running around naked in the Garden of Eden with the idea that God is watching everything they do and punishing them for every sin that they make. This is part of why people want to throw that in the trash, because nobody wants to live like that. But if we throw that in the trash, then government's going to set up as a proxy and try to become that force, and then literally inflict punishment on you through man's law, up to including the death penalty or worse. And the death penalty includes frying you in an electric chair for disobedience to the state under the guise of capital punishment. So anybody that believes in capital punishment better understand that these governments will use that death penalty and that electric torture by fire and call themselves moral people for non-compliance with the state. And these are anything but moral people. These are sadistic, destroyed, evil people that want to not only refuse truth, they want to be the arbiter of truth and become God. And that comes all the way down to the ground level. Anybody that believes that control is the answer, believes in government, believes in socialism, which I've defined as the idea that the answer to every problem is control, are in fact evil. And I want to define evil as that which destroys freedom, which we learned in the Jeremy Locke, The End of All Evil. It's a good definition. It's a good working definition of freedom or of evil to understand, so we can better understand freedom and human sovereignty. Because the idea of man as the highest power and man as the maker of law is the overthrowing of the Creator, which is law. So the best way to describe the force that we call God or the Creator is law. And that's what we have to understand, is that we still have free will to break that law, but we don't have free will without consequence. And that force will stand to eternity, and man will never have the power to change it, but he does have the power to try to overthrow it, and then that ultimately leads to human suffering, then ultimately stagnation and extinction. But the phenomenon is that man wants to be the arbiter of truth, which is the refusal of truth, and then set himself up as the lawmaker, which is the very act of overthrowing the law, which is the Creator. So it's the very act of overthrowing God. And this is what the allegory in the Adam and Eve is about. It's not about if you eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that makes you evil. It's that if you try to arbitrate the knowledge of good and evil and be the lawmaker, that's what makes you evil. So the biting of the apple is the grasping at the highest command in the universe, to overthrow the Creator, to be the arbiter of truth. See, because we got to understand, a 4-year-old could do a politician's job, or anybody could do a politician's job, because their primary job, number one, is to be hated. But all they're doing is going up there and regurgitating the lie, which doesn't really require having to learn anything. That's the easiest thing that can do. Anybody could do it because that's the lie. The truth is difficult. That's something that has to be earned, and everybody, people would be perfectly content telling you that they know something that they don't, as long as they can get you to believe it, because that's much easier than actually learning it. So the lie is easy. The truth is difficult, and it takes responsibility. So we have to understand that even a 4-year-old could do the job of these politicians because all they're doing is regurgitating the lie, and that's easy. But what we're talking about, a child can't really learn and understand at a deep enough level because they don't have enough experience in life. I mean, they can connect to it, but that's a different subject. We're talking about the way the humans develop in the stages of consciousness. And those go through different phases. But the formative years are basically 1 to the age of 6. That's why, the Jesuit priest says, give me the child to the age of 7 and he'll belong to the church for life. That means that when we lay down the formatting, when all knowledge is being taken in unfiltered before they have their biases, and give me the child at the age of 7, they'll belong to the church for life. That's what that means, is that's when the formatting goes down. And then after that, the programming starts going in. And then that programming is where the bias starts. So up to that point, the age of 6, the child is essentially taking in all knowledge unfiltered. So that's what that's about.
I think a great deal of damage was caused also by the literalization and the anthropomorphization of this creator figure.
Yeah.
And the literalization of some of this symbolic depictions, I guess, or allegories, utilized to teach this kind of things, these mysteries.
That's right, because the literalization, both hemispheres of the brain do not have to be engaged. And that's what the appeal to the ego is. It's like, it's a left brain materialist prospect, which is where the ego wants to go. The ego wants to go into the pure materialism. So the phenomenon that you're describing is a big part of our dilemma as a species, is because we've literalized the primitive expression and reduced the symbol and sign language to mundane storytelling. And then we've anthropomorphized, which means ascribed human characteristics to the zoo typology, which gives us the idea, or the ideographic types, which were the symbols that represented certain concepts and certain principles in nature. And modern scholars have made a mistake that the ancient elders would never have made, and they've confused and construed propitiation of elemental powers with propitiation of ancestry. So the ancient elders would have never made that mistake, and this is what leads us into this materialist prospect and this proxy world, and then this decline of the ancient primitive expression of symbol and sign language, declining into storytelling, which is mundane storytelling, where the allegory and the moral principle teaching is lost. But that's also a phenomenon of the anthropomorphizing of the ideographic types. And this is where it leads us into this idea of this monotheism, which gives us this, sky daddy looking down, and and then we see in the Greek mythology they start ascribing more, human characteristics to these, in a polytheistic sense. Now we've got, more than just one sky daddy. Now we've got all these gods, and they're coming down, mingling with the daughters of men and all of this. This is part of what this confusing propitiation of elemental powers with propitiation of ancestry, that's what that phenomenon is about. And there's a lot more to say about it, but in the Greek pantheon, we find these jealous, vengeful gods, and they have these human emotions and human relationships and human characteristics, and they're actually interacting with daily life and all this. And this is where this confusion comes from. And the ancient elders would have never made that mistake. They would have never confused propitiation of elemental powers with propitiation of ancestry, and they understood the danger of anthropomorphizing ideographic types, which didn't really happen until, much, much later in the development of their mythology in the hero cults. So the hero cult, remember, it deals with a cycle, and it deals with a prospect to attain to a higher type, or a prospect to attain, to a higher understanding, a higher awareness, an evolution, and the prospect of an everlasting soul, and the prospect of eternal life on earth in the physical world, and that death is just part of a never-ending cycle. So it's not something to be feared, but it's something that in order for us to fully experience, we need to take the responsibility of cleaning up our room before we go out to play. Because all we can do, the best that we can do, is come back and find it in the same mess that we left it in. So we're not going anywhere. If we ascribe this idea of other dimensions and all this stuff, that gives us the idea that we're somewhere else that we can go, that we're going to go take harp lessons on a cloud with a dead relative, or get out of here and go somewhere else and never have to come back here. And I'm telling you,
still part of the literal, take the literalization of some of these representations.
That's right, and we got to understand that the danger in that, and then part of understanding the early culture is coming to terms with the fact that this is what.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry, no, just saying, and the consequences that this had, they're quite drastic and terrible.
That's right. And I'm trying to explain, or I'm going to be trying to explain that the earliest hero cult in all its phases had understood this. And by understanding that, then we begin to understand what they're endeavoring to do and why. So part of that is, becoming educated properly in some of this arcane knowledge, and that's why we can't afford to throw those babies out with the bathwater, and understand that these earliest ideas for religion, as we call it, were in fact just trying to determine and understand cause and effect, and that it's in fact a science and a truth discovery method that predates language, and that once we get into the textual forms, we're already dealing with ambiguity, because we're dealing with a limited, arbitrated interpretation of a much more vast concept that can't fully be described or explained with words. So this is part of the dilemma. And then this anthropomorphizing of ideographic zoo types, for instance, is what leads us into the dangerous ideology we call monotheism, and the idea of the sky daddy. And then now cultural wars can be waged on a grand scale under the guise that, my God is better than your God. Or if we use the word God, whose God are we talking about now? And then we have all this ambiguity, and there's a lot to it. But you could see that we're just now starting to scratch the surface. But also, back to the hero cult, remember that the hero cult is dealing with the cycle, and it's dealing with the prospect to evolve ourselves to a higher type and forge this relationship with this creator by understanding this causality and then being able to teach it to others.
I wanted to ask you why hero cult? Why is it called hero cult?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure that I'm going to answer it the way that people might expect. But the idea that the hero cult is back to what I said, you know, in the Tolkien allegory, when Frodo says, if you don't do it, no one will. It comes down to the responsibility of the individual to do that which is necessary to earn those rites of passage. And those rites of passage just allow us to mature from child to adult, where we can understand these more difficult, serious concerns and develop this spiritual armor, which is truth discovery, as to not be manipulated by the dogma in the world that's propagated by the psychopaths that want to control everything, that think that you know, man can be the arbiter of truth and man is the highest power and can be the maker of law. So without that spiritual armor, we're too easy. It's going to be just, you know, a piece of cake for these dark psychologists that have all this knowledge to manipulate us. So we have the responsibility as an individual to develop that spiritual armor, earn those rites of passage, and not be manipulated by this dogma and these you know, people that want to control, and then pass that knowledge on and find ways to preserve that knowledge for progeny and posterity. So, I mean, that's not the totality of the answer, but it's a good start. What do you got to say to that?
Yeah, so basically, you know, we are our own, you know, heroes. We have to do our own, you know, everyone has the responsibility to do his own hero's journey. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that is what I mean, because the alternative to that is, you know, the heroes are going to be the ones that, you know, are winning for the socialists and the ones that believe in man's law. And then those are going to be the heroes in the form of order followers and order givers and order followers grandstanding on the corpses of their victims. Those are not heroes. You know, we don't need somebody, we don't need an official of the state to get a kitten out of a tree. You know, so, and I'm saying that in order for everything an order follower does is not necessarily a bad action, but that the thinking is flawed, because everything that the order follower does is to bolster the integrity of the state, or done at the behest of a state. Ideally, they're getting a paycheck for that. So, you know, they could do the most benevolent act in the world, rush into a burning building and save somebody from you know, a perilous fate of being burned alive in a fire. But the question is, would they do that without that paycheck? Would they do it just on the grounds that it's the right thing to do? You know, so we have to understand that if we don't be the hero, then the state will define what your heroes are. And, you know, and then they will lead us totally into the world of dogma, because everything that they're trying to build is built on the lie that man can be the lawmaker. And, you know, the idea that man can be the lawmaker is throwing the creator itself and the truth itself out with the bathwater, so we can get back to the lie that man is the arbiter of truth and can arbitrate law. You know, so that's part of what this dilemma is. And there's a lot more to say about these hero cults. So that's kind of where we're going to go into, you know, from here, as we're going out of the totemic sociology into the earliest hero cult, which is stellar. And that means that, you know, part of the understanding the early or the different phases of the hero cults, we're talking about the different phases of the evolution of the Egyptian mythology, which begins in the stellar phase. And the stellar phase meant that they venerated in the stars and planets, primarily the stars of the circumpolar constellations, beginning in the south and then moving into the north. So the earliest hero cult is stellar, and there's three phases: the early, the middle, and the late phase. In the early phase, they're venerating in circumpolar constellations in the south, and then they begin to move it into the north. And then at that point, they recognize the danger of these prospects of the poles, the polarity of the poles becoming polarized. So there's a contingency in the middle phase called the double Hermanicus, which is that we recognize the double horizon in the south and in the north as one deity. So when these things become polarized, then these things go to war with each other. So because we moved it in the north, we could say that the god of the North Pole, Horus, has deposed the god of the South Pole, Set. And now we have this everlasting perpetual war in heaven, and then one deity gets ascribed to the centropic force, and the other deity described as the centropic force.
Yeah,
so the centropic force, which is denotes or typifies evil, now gets dominated by the god of the North Pole. Horus deposes the god of the South Pole, Sut, S-U-T, which is where we get the word south. And we have this. See, the problem with this is that the southern hemisphere is typically associated with the spiritual realm. And it's a real phenomenon that has to be understood. This is part of understanding these unseen forces, is that the prospect of going into the north is associated with the physical realm, and that's associated with masculine. Masculine is a dominating principle. So the danger of going into the north is the danger that the masculine principle will dominate the feminine spiritual aspect. And that's exactly part of what the phenomenon leads to. And that begins with this primacy in the north. Part of the reason that they brought it in the north is because it was an inevitable certainty. But another part of the reason is because that's where they found the ideal place to store it in the uranography. And they venerated it into the constellation Ursa Minor, which is a group of 7 stars, with the North Star as the brightest in that constellation, which typified the Ka, but also the divine prospect of the Creator itself. So the Ursa Minor denotes the 7, but it also denotes the 8. So you have the 7 stars and then the 1 constellation. That gives you the 8. And then it's in relation to the 6, because the 6 is the the 7 glorious ones, could be the divine aspect, and the 6 glorious ones. But the 6 denotes transition. But it also, it's in correspondence to the 7. So the 6 can represent a failure. If we don't attain of the 7, then the 6 can represent a failure. So the 7 is the divine prospect. That's where we forge this connection with this Creator. And that also is in the Elohim, which is the Elohim is a group of 7, the 5 visible planets, and then the sun and the moon. But that's a little bit more difficult to explain, but I can do it. But I'm going to keep going on this, understanding this circumpolar constellation in the north. Now, what they learned was that the pole star, the northern star, actually is the fixed. That's part of what they're venerating, is the fixity of this pole star. So part of them venerating it into the north, taking it out of the south and venerating it into the north, is that they found this ideal constellation to put it in this group of 7, because, as I said, the elemental powers had been typified in a group of 7. So this was part of understanding this septenary and understanding. But see, what they learned is part of what they're venerating is the fixity of the pole star, which represents the force in nature that holds things in equipoise, that holds things in balance. So part of what they're venerating is the fixity of this pole star. But in fact, this pole star will not stay stationary. And it's also This is their timekeeping method. They're keeping their time in these great epoch cycles of this great year cycle of 26,000 year cycles, because they understand the danger of venerating in annual cycles, because annual cycles, they can't keep track of these long epochs of time. So that makes the prospect of the knowledge and the chronology becoming compromised far greater. So they recognize that danger. So the earliest timekeeping method was venerating into the shifting of the circumpolar constellation pole star. So what they came to understand is that there's 7 of these pole stars in succession, and that each one takes the position of the station at the pole 7 times. That phenomenon happens 7 times in a 26,000 year roughly cycle. So roughly each pole star takes its place and holds its place for about 3,600 years, and then is replaced ultimately by the next succeeding star. And that each time there's a pole star shift, this is where we get the idea of the deluge. And then the flood is the waters of space.
Yeah, it's the deluge is basically when a star would sink below a star was not visible anymore.
Well, and it had shifted out of its primary spot, and then another star coming in to replace it. So each time that happens, that's a deluge. But when the entire, from the point where they start the cycle and start to venerate in the cycle, which is what we got to learn to understand where the cycle will start, so we can count the number of epochs to understand how much time this actually represents. Each epoch representing essentially roughly 26,000 years. So if we had 10 epochs, then we could easily arrive at 260,000 years. So we have to understand each time the pole star shift is a deluge, but when the cycle commences and then from where it starts and then recommences and starts again, that's the great deluge.
Oh, right.
So each time there's a pole star shift, that means there's potential for knowledge being lost. And that's part of what the fear is. And it's a very real danger. But it's also potential to break the chronology, which has the potential to cut us off from source and break our connection with ancestry, ultimately, lose our entire body of knowledge up to that point. So it's a very real danger. And it was a very grave concern of the elders. This is part of what they're endeavoring to do. So,
there were, I'd have a few things to say, but I wanted to go back a little bit to sort of to make people understand the whole phenomenon of venerating the different stars, and also the double what you mentioned with about the double horizon.
That's right.
Yeah. So basically, this regards the migration that took place in the along the Nile Valley, right? From the south.
That's correct.
Going to the north. When these people were in the south, they basically venerated the southern pole star, right?
That's correct.
So when they, as they were going to the north, you'll get to a point where you see both.
That's right. That's the double Hermanicus.
Okay.
Where we can see both circumpolar constellations, and that's where the contingency for not recognizing both gods of the stations at the pole as different aspects of the same deity. So then we have this polarization of the monad, or this polarization of the one, and that's a danger. Yeah. So the halfway point where we can see both horizons is where the first secret society would begin, because that would be the first contingency where they needed a backup plan.
Because you're losing
the prospect of losing.
Oh, okay.
The prospect of polarizing these things. And then one other thing I wanted to say, one reason that it was inevitably going to be moved into the north, because there really wasn't an identifiable fixed pole star. So in the south, they were really venerating in the constellations.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they didn't really recognize a fixed pole star. So part of the significance of moving it into the north is the venerating of the fixity of the pole star, because that represented the equipoise and the equilibrium and the balance that's held by the one, and that's part of it,
So another controversial or confused point that we find is it's the one regarding cults and culture in general. So I would ask you, what are cults, and why are they, and what is their importance?
It's a good question, and it's not going to be an easy question to answer. The first thing I'm going to do is actually reach for the wiki dictionary here, and I'm just going to use a basic dictionary. Typically, a cult could be defined as a system of religious veneration and devotion directed toward a particular figure or object. Or another definition, a relatively small group of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or sinister. Another definition, that's giving a misplaced or excessive admiration for a particular person or thing. Example, cult of personality surrounding the leaders. And another definition, person or thing that is popular or fashionable, especially among a particular section of society. For instance, a cult film. So there's some basic definitions that we have to work with. And we have to understand how a cult can become dangerous to other people that doesn't ascribe to its idealism. It can, become dangerous because it could begin to attack, or defend against anybody outside of its ideology paradigm. But the word itself, I would tell you, is a concept that is derived from the idea, we're talking about the word cult. I would tell you comes from ideally the word culture, and that the word culture ideally would be derived from agriculture. So there's several things that are part of understanding this, and including the origins of how this all came about, which, like I said, begins with these hero cults. Because in the hero cult, remember, we're dealing with the cycle. And the original cycle was in the southern circumpolar constellations. Then at the point where we could see both southern and northern circumpolar constellations, the contingency of the double Hermanicus or the double horizon, which is the contingency for these gods of the poles, these opposite poles becoming polarized. So we have to understand that the primary deity, the original deity, is venerated in the southern circumpolar constellation and in Set Anup, which is in the form of a jackal. And that the concern is that if it moves into the north, these things could become polarized. And while they represent two different aspects of the same deity, they could be polarized, and then all of a sudden we could have these two deities and these two aspects going to war with each other or becoming adversarial. So that's part of the danger. But the need to put a finer point on time is part of what's driving this understanding of causality in its earliest forms, but also a way to chronicleize our genuine human history. So part of the decline of the hero cult is man's ambition to put a finer point on time, and that's driven partly as we go into the north, forcing us into more need for utility. and that this utilitarianism is what leads us into this masculine dominant prospect and this Roman pragmatism and this materialistic ambition, is this need for utilitarianism. This is part of the phenomenon, and what I would tell you the ancients recognized as a real danger. But in the earliest phases, agriculture is very important to their survival, and knowing when to plant and when to harvest for real in terms of agriculture. For instance, at the equator, we actually have 3 planting seasons. But as we move into the north, that's narrowed down, and then, basically get far enough into the north, you're only going to have a summer and a winter, and the only planting season is going to be summer. So we're going to have to find another way, for crops to sustain us through the harsh season of the winter. But ideally, part of the human dilemma was a result of man's ambition to put a finer point on time, driven by the need for agriculture. And then the moving into the north, driving us into the need for utility, and which leads to utilitarianism and then materialistic prospect. So remember, I said part of the danger of going into the north was that it corresponds to the masculine aspect, and that has potential to dominate, because that is part of the nature of the masculine principle, is to dominate. But this idea of agriculture is where we derive the word culture. And in my first presentation, the superior knowledge of the ancient Egyptian elders, I talked a lot about this, but that agriculture was very important, and then the need to put a finer point on time is a science. So the timekeeping is a science. So I'm going to try to put that into a context that we can work with. But the earliest phase of the agriculture is in the stellar phase, which is the earliest hero cult. And in the earliest stage of this hero cult, there's 3 phases, which we've talked about. The early phase, venerating in southern circumpolar constellations. The middle phase, venerating double horizon, recognizing both gods of the poles as 2 aspects of the same one deity. And then moving at primacy into the north, had the potential to depose the god of the South Pole. So it's the danger of things becoming polarized, and then the god of the North deposing or dominating the original primary deity, which was Sut in the South. So the word culture derived from agriculture. In that presentation, I defined culture in three stages. In the first stage, it means to grow something. And in the earliest phase of this hero cult, they are experience evolution and growth. So this is the point where they have a genuine truth discovery and the balanced brain to really understand the signs in nature, to flesh these things out and create a spiritual armor that protects us from sliding into dogma. That's part of what they're endeavoring to do. So in the first phase, there's growth. And culture, I described in the first phase, it means to grow something. But in the second phase, there's danger of imperialism. We're sliding into utilitarianism. We're risking breaking our chronology and cutting us off from source. So in the second phase, there's a phenomenon where the early body of knowledge has become not understood and now is becoming vestigial. So the second phase of the culture is clinging to vestigial forms, and then it serves in that way to protect against imperialist infiltration by stealth. So if somebody comes in to the culture and they don't have the same customs and traditions, they could stand out like a sore thumb. So in that way, the culture, even in vestigial form, is preserving, fragments of the original source knowledge. So in that way, it's benevolent. but it's become vestigial, so it's lost its potency. But it's still effective in the sense that it's protecting against infiltration by stealth. And then in the third phase, which is where we find ourselves now, culture is acting to beat us onto the cultural track of obedience. So, an example of that is if you don't do what the government tells you you should be doing, then you're going to stand out like a sore thumb, and then society is going to begin to police itself and beat you or force you onto that track of obedience. So that's how I define culture in three phases in my first presentation. It's very important to understand. And but the need for the agriculture is part of what's driving this, but also the truth discovery of understanding causality and these hidden laws in nature is also driving this. But as we go into the north, we become more reliant on utility, and that forces us into utilitarianism, which becomes a spiritual prospect, and then the culture becomes totally corrupt. So we have to understand all those phases in order to understand this culture. And the only way we're going to understand its pure form is to understand what the early hero cult is endeavoring to do and why, which I would tell you is understanding the actual reasons why the pyramids ended up being built, because that was a sum total of all of the knowledge that they had up to that point. So this Terence McKenna quote, culture is not your friend, it's your cult. Well, there's a lot of truth in that in the current phase of this culture, because right now, culture is really only serving us to force us onto the track of obedience, which is a socialist program coercively enforced by government and basically training the population to indoctrinate you into this erroneous belief that man can be the lawmaker. And in that phase, it's very dangerous. So this idea of culture in that phase is very dangerous. But throwing that baby out with the bathwater would mean taking us back to the very beginnings with no traces and no aspects of this culture, with technology highly developed, and it would basically be an extinction event. So we have to understand that while these religions and these other traditions have deteriorated into vestigial forms, if we throw those babies out with the bathwater, then we'll have no chance of ever being able to recover, because in all of these, through the comparative study, we can find the ubiquity that can take us back to the source, which is in Egypt. So we have to understand that and be careful about throwing this baby out with the bathwater. And this word cult, again, we gave the basic definitions of it, which basically describes it. How I would say it, other than I would add that, it can become dangerous, like, the military and police, those are cults. And, they act as a hammer, and anybody that is defiant is going to stick up like a nail. So to the dominating mentality in that type of a culture, the nail that stands up gets hammered down. And that entails coercive violence. And then the problem with that is people see that type of violence as justified by the legitimacy of the state. So that's a very real danger, and we need to understand that. But again, part of the science of the agriculture is trying to put a finer point on time. And like I say, in the early phase, they were endeavoring to keep track of these huge epochs of time in the great year cycle, venerating that ultimately in the north, in the northern circumpolar constellations, which is a succession of the 7 pole stars at the station. And we have to understand that because this is part of understanding that the pyramid builders, which are the stellar people, and that the pyramids were built in the stellar phase, which was the earliest phase of the hero cult. The pyramids were built at the end of that before they went into the next phase, which is lunar. And they understood that lunar was a dangerous prospect, because not only were they going to change the timekeeping method to annual cycles, but that they were going to venerate no longer in southern, ultimately northern circumpolar constellations, but constellations west to east and east to west. So that would cause a disorientation, which could amount to a schism. So we have to understand that schism is about orientation, and it's very difficult to stay oriented. We have to be able to orient ourselves terrestrially and celestially. Because, one difference between the ancient body of knowledge, the ancient science, we can call it, and modern science is it was all self-contained, one body of knowledge. And in the modern world, those things have been split into science and religion, where religion deals with the unseen forces and basically ascribes a dogma to deal with that. And then science itself has become dogmatic because it ignores unseen forces and wants us to force us into this Newtonian empirical paradigm. And in order for there to be something objective, there has to be an object. So it just wants to ignore the unseen forces. And then the other part of the scientific dogma is that they're teaching, since Thomas Watson and Francis Crick's theory published in 1962, that we're controlled by genes, and that's what they're teaching in the universities. And that's a fallacy. We're not controlled by genes. So we're actually teaching a religion in the sense of erroneous belief systems. We're teaching a religion in the universities that we're controlled by genes. And we can understand why they're wanting to do that, because Big Pharma is not selling energy, they're selling drugs and control. So that's a very real danger, and we have to understand that. But in the stellar phase, they refused to venerate in annual cycles because they understood the danger of it. That's why they venerated in the circumpolar constellations, and they marked their annual year by what's called the inundation, which is the rising of the Nile Valley, spilling its water from the Great Lakes region in Central Africa and flowing north and emptying into the delta of the Mediterranean. That this flooding would spill the fluvian soils and replenish the lands for the next fertile season. And that was denoted or typified by the scarab beetle, basically would appear just before the inundation and began its fertility cycle. That's part of how the scarab beetle became associated with the Egyptian mythology, because it marked the inundation. And that has to do with the stellar culture understanding the danger of venerating in annual cycles, which included the prospect of breaking our chronology and totally diluting or corrupting, which would break us off from our ancestry, which breaks us off from source, could ultimately compromise the entire body of knowledge that had been developed at that point. So it was a very real danger. So they venerated in the rising of the heliacal rising of the star Sirius to mark the inundation, and also of the cycle of the scarab beetle beginning its fertility cycle. And that's how that came to be in the stellar phase. And that's very ancient. It's far more ancient. So we're talking about a time period of at least, 300,000 years ago, and that the pyramids had actually been built at the end of that, which was, in my estimate, 150,000 years ago, which is when the lunar phase begins. So I just wanted to outline the three phases of the cultures and outline that there's three phases of each one of those phases. So the first phase is the stellar phase, and you have the early, middle, and end. And the differences in the early phase are venerating in southern circumpolar constellations, middle phase double horizon, which is the contingency, and then the late phase venerating ultimately in northern circumpolar constellations. And that's a big part of why the pyramids were built, as a contingency to remind us that it had been moved primacy in the north. So that has a lot to do with why the pyramids were built, to understand this danger, because in the annual phase, that's akin to westing, and westing means the same thing. It's the prospect of a masculine domination, because the West is associated with the masculine in the annual phase. So westing in the solar and lunar phase is the masculine dominant prospect, is the same as primacy in the north in the lunar in the stellar phase. So then when we go into lunar cycles, we have the early, middle, and end phase of that. And the early phase is best understood by understanding the late phase of the stellar, because they're trying to bring on everything from the stellar into the lunar. So the best way to understand the early phase of the lunar is to understand the late phase of the stellar. And then the best way to understand the late phase of the lunar is to understand the early phase of the solar. And just I'll say this about the middle phase of the lunar is where they have the deity Kensu. And that Kensu is the contingency. It means double horizon. So again, they're still dealing with this very real phenomenon of these hero cults and the prospect of things becoming polarized. So the contingencies that they're making is the contingency to prevent this polarization of this deity or this cause, whatever you want to call it. And then in the early phase of the solar is different than the current phase that we're in now, which is the late phase. And, there's a lot to say about the different phases of the solar, which I won't be able to fully explain now. But I would just say that the early phase of the solar, they're still venerating in night sky. And then by the time we get to the cult of Amen-Ra, which is about 80,000 years ago, the first 20,000 years of the solar phase, they were still venerating in night sky, because it's about 100,000 years we've been in this solar phase, and that the lunar phase had lasted about 50,000 years. So we're still venerating in night sky, and we're still not into the double digits in the sacred geometry and the sacred arithmetic. So in the early phase of the solar, we're dealing with the 9, and I would tell you that was Sun and Moon and Ursa Minor, which is the 7 stars of Ursa Minor, which typify the 7 circumpolar pole stars. But that and that corresponds to the 9 pyramids of Mexico. That 9, and that represents the Ptah, the great architect. But in the cult of Amen-Ra, they began to venerate in day sky. And that the middle phase of the solar is where the eschatology is perfected. Following the cult of Amen-Ra, they're taking it back into night sky and venerating in the cult of Osiris. And I would tell you, as I outlined in my presentation from Seed 4, that that's where they had perfected the eschatology. So what that means is eschatology means final things, so it's part of the mythology that deals with the afterlife cycle of the journey of the mains through the netherworld, and then, offers the prospect of an eternal soul. So when I say perfected, I mean that everything after that is a decline. And that in the cult of Osiris, we still had the potential to trace it back to the purest forms in the stellar phase. But then once it goes into the decline, it's more dogma is coming in and obliterating or obscuring that prospect to recover pure forms. So now we're going into the greater mysteries, and then the lesser mysteries are being compromised, basically because we've strayed too far from source, but also neglect is a factor, and I talked about all that. But keep that in mind, because that's a big factor. And then the late phase of the solar phase is where we are now, into this cult of the cross. So Abraham doctrines, we've talked about that, but this Christianity and this cult of the cross is the pinnacle of the Egyptian mythology, but it's in a deteriorated, stagnated form in the sense that it's been literalized and historicized. So there's the 3 phases and the 3 stages of each phase of the cults, these hero cults, and how that and that Christianity and this cult of the cross is the pinnacle of each stage of these hero cults. Let me just say one more thing that's going to be very advanced, but I'm going to just say it very directly, that the Osiris was discovered in the stellar phase, but it was held back because the Osiris deals with the 5, and the 5 is encapsulated in the pyramidion, or the bird's eye view of the pyramid. You have the X and then the point in the center. So and that's also typified by the cross, which actually represents the gods of the four corners, which represents the directions, north, south, east, and west. But that gives us the right angle, and that Osiris is the god of the equipoise, the things that hold all things in balance. And that's venerated in the pyramidion, which is denoted or typified by the perfected ashlar, which is triangle on top of square, which typifies the three, the original trinity, the spiritual prospect above the physical, which is represented by the four. So the triangle or the pyramid on top of the cube, or the triangle on top of the square, is it happened in the stellar phase, but that they had held back the 5 because the 5 doubled produces the 10. And now we're going into the greater mysteries. Everything beyond the 7, we're going into the greater mysteries. So we got to be careful with that. And they understood this. And I think they held that back because they understood that would yield powers of 10. And powers of 10 is what actually allows us in the greater mysteries to wield these forces in nature. So that's part of the reason I think that the Aten had been held back and Osiris was held back. That Osiris is preserved in the bird's eye view of the pyramid in the form of the 5 with the 4 points, and then, or the gods of the 4 corners, and then the center point representing Osiris and the Ka, but ideally Osiris holding all things in equipoise. And that is also, you know, the Christian cross represents the equilateral cross, but with the extended bottom stem, that's primacy in the north. So if you put that on the South Pole, you'd have an upside down cross. This is how the god of the South Pole became associated with the underworld, Hades, ultimately the devil, and then the upside down cross becomes associated with the Antichrist because it's really just primacy in the south. So the upright cross is primacy in the north. But if you're in the south, you know, then we're getting disoriented here. So we have to understand that. Orientation is key. And then, but I wanted to just say that this Osiris is preserved in this 5. And this 5 is the capstone. So the Ben, or the pyramid capstone, which is associated with Christ as the God of the cornerstone, that's what that's about. It's about that number 5. And it's about that bird's eye view of the pyramid, and that the cross represents the gods of the 4 corners, but the also that 4 is associated with the physical realm, and that and then that's the card. You know, so this is double cube. Have to understand that the double cube is or double square is originally about the gods of the 4 corners, and then the points of the zodiac, which represent solstices and equinoxes in the solar and lunar phases, but that the semi-cardinal points are the Sabbats, and those are the points in between the solstices and the equinox. So that's what the double cube typified in the stellar phase represented the octagonal heaven. So that's what's venerated in the double cube, and that is the earliest forms of what we know today as Freemasonry, which in fact in its pure forms is Egyptian science. But the stigma around Freemasonry has to be understood, and we need to be able to make a distinction between 3 things when we're talking about Freemasonry. The institution itself, which can become corrupted and has become corrupted, because as soon as it emerges sub rosa, it's infiltrated by special interests. But we need to make the distinction between the institution and then its alumni, which are its members, and then the actual tradition itself, which is Egyptian science. So as long as we don't understand how to discern those 3 things, we're never going to understand how we got into this world that we're in today, because understanding the evolution of what this Egyptian science is, we can call Freemasonry. It's lockstep, pari passu, with the evolution of the human race. So we're never going to understand the evolution of these ideas without understanding Freemasonry, or Egyptian science in its purest forms. And that's about all I got for us today, Francisco. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree with what you said on Freemasonry. Yeah, we're gonna, as I've said in other, I did other shows on talking about that topic, and its importance, why it's important to understand the tradition, the actual tradition of Freemasonry, and distinguish it from the lodge system basically has become. So
Exactly.
And as you said, it's key to understand the Egyptian science.
That's right.
That you were mentioning. So, well, quite a bit of information there. You said quite a lot. It's I guess it's time to stop this show for today, and hopefully we will be able to come back to further explain some of these concepts.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah, wanted to say that we have also other episodes that we have done together. There's like a couple of episodes that we did, and I think those who are interested should definitely listen to those also, because I think they'll have some of what we talked about. It will be probably clearer. And that said, thank you, Douglas, for having been here, and for talking about this difficult stuff. I know it wasn't easy, so thanks.
Yeah. Well, you're very welcome, and it's always an honor to come on your show, Francisco. I have a great respect for your work, and it's always a pleasure to come on here and try to explain some of these difficult concepts. I'd like to take this opportunity to direct everybody to the Cubbyhole. That's cubbyhole.com. And you can find my work there, along with Nate Cap's work, who's the founder of the website, and Brandon Martin's work there, who's a co-host on the Cubbyhole podcast. And I had a lot more, obviously, that we needed to cover today. I wasn't able to cover it all. I wasn't sure how far we'd get with it. So next time I come back on, we can just call that part 2 of what we started today, which I would call part 1. And I'll look forward to seeing you and everybody back here at that time. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And that is all for today. So until next time, everyone.